Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much. Welcome to Build. I'm your host, Ricky Camilleri. Our next guest is what is commonly referred to as a character actor, a journeyman, a professional, but Tim Blake Nelson, who has not but one, not two, but four projects he's here to talk about, including HBO's Watchmen, The True Don Quixote, The Report, and Just Mercy. Isn't just an actor popping up in your favorite roles. He's a playwright, a filmmaker, a true artist. Let's take a look at him in Just Mercy. Everybody, please welcome the great Tim Blake Nelson. Let's hear it. Sir, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for coming back.
It's my pleasure. I love coming down here and talking to you guys.
Good to see you. You have a number of movies right now that and a television show. Let's talk a little bit about Just Mercy, since we just showed the trailer. We have the poster right here. What made you want to be a part of this film? Who do you play in the film?
Well, I play a real-life character, as do we all in the movie, named Ralph Myers, who bears false witness in a court of law against a guy in a capital crime, who, because of my testimony, in part because of my testimony, ends up on death row. And because I haven't told the truth, I have to come to terms with how that ramifies in his life and the lives of others, including his family, that this guy is going to die because, to save my own life, I perjured myself in his trial. The larger story, though, is about a true American hero, this gentleman named Bryan Stevenson, who for the past 30 years, through his Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, has been fighting for prisoners on death row, not just in Alabama, but all over the country. Knowing that for every 9 people executed, or for every 9 people on death row, every 9 executed, one is innocent, which is an astonishing rate, astonishingly negative rate. And he has devoted his life to the pursuit of justice. It's easier to be guilty and wealthy in America than it is to be innocent and poor.
Yeah, we're seeing that right now, I believe, in the state of Texas, where there's a man on death row.
Yeah.
And someone has just recently come forward with testimony or with evidence that could prove his innocence. And states are always reluctant to allow that evidence through. Once the trial has passed, once guilt has been found, they are very, very reluctant to go back.
Yeah, we're simply too eager to find. We're too eager to implicate, because we're so zealous in pursuit of revenge as a result of heinous crimes, or any crimes at all, for that matter. But particularly the most heinous crime. The more heinous a crime, the more zealous we are in pursuit of a fast answer. And that puts a lot of people on death row who shouldn't be there. And
the less resources you have while fighting for your life on death row, or going into trial for where a death row conviction is being pursued against you, you are most likely going to wind up behind bars. The trial will move swiftly.
Yeah, and with no resources, you end up, or very few resources, and often poor, beleaguered representation, you end up going against the government, whose resources are limitless. And the government's zeal is fueled by outrage in a specific community that just simply wants to see any justice done, even if it's an injustice, so that they can get the relief of their very human, vengeful feelings being satisfied, and then they can move on. And this is often achieved without consideration of the so-called perpetrator, who might not have been the perpetrator at all.
How often do you find that you get to be a part of movies like this with a socio-political theme or a bit of activism behind them, and how often are you looking for projects like that?
I don't go out and look for projects with necessarily a social conscience. I certainly avoid ones that disagree with my own political sensibilities or ethical sensibilities, but I don't look for ones that agree with them, if that makes sense. I just want to play interesting, challenging characters in integral, coherent, novel works of art.
Have you ever found that you were offered something that, and this is just jumping off of what you just said, that may not necessarily go exactly against your ethical stance or your moral stance, but questions it or challenges it, and that in a way kind of tempts you to take a role, or you did take the role?
Well, Just Mercy educated me a tremendous amount. I knew a bit about Bryan Stevenson, but I didn't understand statistically, in a deep statistical way, how much injustice was being perpetrated inside of our legal system in the name of justice until I encountered the work of Bryan Stevenson in a deep and exhaustive way. I'd heard about him on NPR, but I really wasn't intimately familiar with his work. And getting to do this film just simply deepened my understanding of what it is he does, why he does it, and it caused me to do a lot of reading, not just his book, but other books that nuanced my attitude or sensitivity toward what it is to be a person of color in America, how just by virtue of being a white guy, I'm a part of that system, even unwittingly. And I don't have a political drum to beat about this. I'm kind of a moderate guy politically. I'm not a what you'd call a social justice warrior. I don't have anything against, it's just not, I don't get out there and talk about politics publicly. But I became a richer person because of the way this movie, Just Mercy, challenged me, the way its director, Destin Daniel Cretton, challenged me, Michael B. Jordan. Well, it started just when I read the screenplay that he co-wrote with Andrew Lanham and Bryan Stevenson's book, and a commitment on both of our parts that really started with him, because it's Destin's film, in making sure that the way I explored my character was honest, truthful, from inside of me, not from the outside in, and that was thorough. And in that pursuit, I began to understand, in particular, in terms of my role, how the power structure in America exploits the vulnerability and the fears of poor whites against poor blacks. And I hadn't understood that in as deep a way as I did when I started seeing this movie, because when I read this movie, and then really when I started playing the part, because when you play a part, particularly in a movie, when you're on real sets, because we were in a real prison shooting, if you're doing your work correctly, and in an open, honest way, you experience some measure of what your character experiences. And I suddenly understood in a new way how this guy, you saw him, a little bit of him in the trailer, he's a foster kid. He was nearly burned alive when he was 7. He's a career criminal, and he's exploited by the system to put this black guy on death row, because that's what this little county in Alabama wants. And that's the for a lot of reasons, that's the most impactfully vindictive gesture that they can make in response to this white teenage girl being killed. And this guy gets co-opted into being a part of it. And that was really interesting to experience and very challenging in a good way.
You are also there's so much we could talk about with this story, but you have a number of projects. I feel as though we should jump to the next one. That is Watchmen on HBO, which I love. It's a beautiful TV show, or it's a beautiful series, an incredibly strange adaptation of the graphic novel. Let's take a look at a clip and then talk about it. How much did you know about Watchmen before going into this? How much did you know?
I have 3 sons.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
There you go. Yeah.
We're we're a household of 5, and my wife is on a daily basis dealing with 4 nerds. So we knew about Watchmen in our house.
Are you 4 nerds of varying interests, or
yes, we're
similar?
4. We've got a skateboarding nerd, which sounds like an oxymoron, but it's not. We've got a video game history Latin nerd, which is
really
its
king of the nerds
own
there. That's
aggregation. And then we have a music nerd. I have my oldest son is in music conservatory at Oberlin, doing classical music and jazz composition, classical and jazz composition. So he's his own kind of nerd.
You are a theater and film and theater nerd,
and watches and music and literature. I don't know. I cover all the bases.
Culture vulture.
And then I've been impacted in wonderful ways by all 3 of my boys. When I was offered this by Tom Spezialy, who is with whom I'd done another show years ago, and I saw Watchmen, and I thought, oh my God, is this what I think it is? Is this really HBO is doing Watchmen? Oh, I can't believe. And then I read it, and it was the Watchmen universe projected 30 years into the future. And then I put together the fact that it was Tom Spezialy and Damon Lindelof. I already knew how smart Tom Spezialy is. Damon is brilliant as well, and I think has changed the way narrative operates, long-form narrative in television. I think he's like a cubist artist. Yes, you're going to get a face if you stand back and find it, but the eyeball is going to be here, and you're going to get maybe 4 different facets of the same cheek over here, and then there's going to be the other cheek that you're not even supposed to see in a 3-dimensional or even a 2-dimensional image trying to look 3-dimensional, but it's still there and you can see it, and it's just everything is there, but in a way you've never seen it. It's so gorgeously contorted.
One that must make for an exciting thing to view that you're in, because usually I think when you probably watch something that you're in, you can you had an idea as to what was shot and how it's going to come out, and maybe you don't want to watch yourself, but with something like this, you may not have any idea as to what the finished product is going to look like.
Well, to a degree I do, and that's how smart Damon and his writing staff have been, because they've got to shoot the scripts, and so we read the scripts. But just like what the audience is going to experience every week they tune in to Watchmen, you could literally spend the entire week trying to imagine what the beginning of an episode is going to be, where it's going to be again, when it's going to begin, and with what character. You'd never guess it. Right. So the rules for television, because it's meant to be this comforting medium for the end of the day when you get home. It's what they call it, the American hearth. It's supposed to give you that predictable, soothing warmth.
I vaguely remember that last time you were here, you talked about not particularly liking television yourself.
That's correct, yeah.
Yes.
This is a whole different story.
Yeah.
But on most television shows, there are certain rules to which the showrunner is asked to adhere by the network or the studio, which is, if you think of your classic crime show, there's a crime, and then the detectives come in and they
procedural.
Yeah. They visit the site, and then they spend the episode figuring it out, and usually they do, and they meet some characters along the way, and it's
There's one
tied
they
up at
thought
the end.
did it but didn't do it. It
Yeah.
was someone else. Yeah.
Damon just doesn't work in those terms. He just doesn't. You don't know what time. It's cubism. It's just jumbled up. It's all in reverse. You're seeing stuff that you don't think you're supposed to be seeing. You're disoriented, and you only really completely understand it all once the season is over. Now that's exciting.
That said, I feel like one of the things that I like about Damon that I feel like he did really well in The Leftovers and in that he's doing so far in Watchmen is while it is jumbled up, he does adhere to this idea that each episode should be satisfying in and of itself. I watch a lot of television for this, and I find that often now, since this sort of idea that all TV must be serialized, you get a number of episodes that just feel like they're floating and they don't really have a self-contained story within them as long as the serialized element. So far in these 3 episodes, I feel like it's serialized and we're tracking characters, but we also have storylines that kind of begin and end within the episode, or at the very least have a satisfying seeming conclusion. I think of Gene Smart in this last episode.
I'll defer to superior knowledge about television, but I think that's certainly true about Damon, and it's remarkable what he and his writers are able to pull off. He's just a I think a generational creator. Mm-hmm. If I'm using that correctly, and I'm really, really excited to get to play this character for him.
You yourself are a writer. You've written and directed films. You've written plays. Would you consider yourself? And this is a horrible question. Excuse me, but I'm curious what it's like for a creator, someone who works on a regular basis to create their own work, to work with what they consider a generational talent, and how that translates to how you view your own work and your own process.
I operate in this space in any way that I can in terms of being an actor and a filmmaker and a writer. I've associated with people like Damon Lindelof, worked for them. I've worked for the Coen brothers, Terrence Malick, Steven Spielberg, Jay Roach, another wonderful director, Miguel Arteta, and about, I don't know, probably 70 others. Some of them, and I've worked with amazing actors, Sean Penn and Daniel Day-Lewis, and I guess, and Phil Hoffman. I know when I'm in the presence of people who are working at another level.
Do you find that those people who, even though you perceive them are working at another level, still have a process that is similar to those who you may not view are at another level? In the sense that they take notes, they're engaged, they're trying to hear what people have to say. And
that's a good question. Some do and some don't. I think everyone is different. I've tried to pick up better habits for myself. And there have been people who have impacted me in such a profound way that it's changed completely the way I approach how I write or act or direct. And that remains, all 3 of those remain in flux. They're all evolving processes, because as a kind of journeyman who gets to work with a lot of different people on a lot of different projects in all sorts of different styles and media, I just keep getting to meet a lot of these people. And that has just been an incredibly nurturing, rich experience for me. And and I try to learn from all of these people.
At the risk of putting you on the spot, and don't think too long. If you don't have a story, we'll move on very quickly. Is there a moment that you remember with one of these people that changed your perception of your own work or how you could work?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've told this story before. I have a lot of them. But I guess one of the more recent ones was about, I think it was about 7 years ago. I'd gotten to a point in my career where it all felt like I had it under control, and I knew my process, that I would just sort of swing from movie to movie playing interesting character roles. And offers kept reliably coming in, and I would do the part after part. And
all right, I got a career.
yeah, I've got a career. I don't really have to worry so much about that anymore. And it took 20 years for me a good 20 plus years for me to get to that point. But I was, let's just call it, somewhat complacent. And I got a call from James Franco's producer, this guy named Vince Jolivet. And I was invited out to play a role in James Franco's movie, Child of God. And I knew the novel really well. I'd actually read it myself, and then I'd read it with one of my nerd sons.
McCarthy novel, right?
Yeah, Child of God by Cormac McCarthy. And I was going to play the sheriff in this film. And I got to Virginia, West Virginia. Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. No, West Virginia. I'm sorry, it doesn't matter. I'm just getting neurotic.
The audience is on pins and needles.
Yeah, sorry.
West Virginia,
okay,
or Virginia.
Sorry. So anyway, and they were shooting the movie on Canon 5Ds, which is a little SLR camera with adapters and Zeiss lenses.
Or the original SLRs. Right?
Yeah. Well, digital SLRs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
And the crew was tiny, and we were all staying in a roadside inn. And I'm pretty sure James was financing the production out of his own pocket. And I don't think the budget was over $500,000, which is very little money to make a movie on distant location. And there was just such an overabundance of real artistic spirit on that set, the likes of which I hadn't encountered on larger budget sets for years, and more importantly, the likes of which I hadn't encountered in myself for years. It took me back to the idealism of being a student. And it just reminded me not to waste my opportunities, because James was working with a crew in an utterly idealistic and truly communal way. We were all making $100 a day. Or I think maybe the SAG actors, we were making SAG scale, so that might have been a little more. But it was as egalitarian as it could possibly be in terms of crew and the people in front of the camera and James himself and his producers. And I just thought, this is reminding me of why I do it. And don't you dare, I said to myself, get complacent again. Because here's this guy, James, who's got everything. And this was at the point where James was at the top of his career. And he was devoting himself to this project with this tiny crew, telling a very risky story with this wonderful actor named Scott Hayes, giving this very difficult character his all. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go back to New York, and I am changing the way I work. And I did.
And you changed the way that you work in the sense that you put more into your own work at that point? You started thinking more about your own
just
films?
in every respect. Right. And about that time, I also was working with, I had just worked with Daniel Day-Lewis.
Lincoln, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I watched him work, and putting that together with James's idealism and just the seriousness with which Daniel Day-Lewis was taking his work, and it shamed me in a very good way. And I think I've just gotten better since then, because I've worked harder, more diligently, more carefully, and I've demanded more of myself, and also in a strange way more of the projects to which I say yes. It's made me more selective, because if I don't see that passion that I saw from James in putting so much of his own skin in the game, and not just his money, but his power as a star at that moment in his career, then it's less interesting to me, and I'm not sure I want to be on that person's set.
I'm curious about that in regards to, I mean, right now you are starring in Watchmen, which is a subversive take on the superhero genre. But over the last few weeks, there's been, hesitate to use the word controversy. I would just say something that people are talking about. And yesterday, Martin Scorsese penned an op-ed in the New York Times about how he felt about the overabundance of superhero movies in the multiplex and basically in mainstream cinema, and how it's pushing out what he refers to as more risky art house films. I mean, I tend to agree. I do lots of superhero interviews, and I think those movies do have their place in a way, but I do tend to agree with, as someone who grew up on art film and, loves those types of quote unquote risky movies, I do pine for the days where those were explored more by the mainstream. Where do you fall in regards to that, and as to whether or not superhero movies can be cinema?
I think, of course, they can be cinema. I love Martin Scorsese's movies. I've seen every one of them. I will see every one of them. I think he is an extraordinary man. And an extraordinary filmmaker, one of the best who's ever breathed. He defined a genre. I wouldn't say he created it, but he redefined it, what the gangster movie is. And when he has gone outside of that genre, the movies he's made have been extraordinary. Does he make cinema in the highest sense? Yes, absolutely. The op-ed, which I read last night, is gorgeously written.
Isn't it wonderfully written? Yeah.
It's a great and persuasive piece of rhetoric. But I think that a movie like Logan is cinema. And I think that there are images that appear in the Marvel movies that are absolutely cinematic. Where I do agree with him is that because there's so much money involved, I think that, yes, there's a kind of there's a kind of artist by committee aspect to superhero movies that can threaten the sort of authorship that Martin Scorsese or Francis Ford Coppola or the Coen brothers or Paul Thomas Anderson, many of these artists, or even I on my tiny little movies that few see, that have. And I think once that gets threatened, that's probably not good in certain respects for the risks that you want an artist to be able to take in the film medium. But so that to me was his most persuasive, trenchant point. With that, I agree, and I think that's an issue. I still think, though, that you see images in the most cynical superhero movie that are gorgeously artistic. They occur, and therefore, since those images are cinema or are cinematic, I'm not sure that you can so easily dismiss Marvel movies or superhero movies as prima facie just not cinema. I don't think that's fair, and I'm not sure really how useful it is. Do I want for the movies that I make to play in movie theaters? Yes. Is Martin Scorsese right in that these sorts of films crowd movies like mine out? Yes. But at the same time, you do have places like at least in the big cities, like Film Forum and IFC Center and Alamo Drafthouse and the Nighthawk, or Village Cinema East, Angelica Film Center, that still play specialized movie. Even in the city where I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, you have Circle Cinema. You have the Dobie in Austin. I think we're going to figure it out. And I'd rather just personally not spend my time being cranky about superhero movies.
I would say, and this might be too tangential, but in regards to little movies that you make, as you described them in reference to the sort of massive, big budget Marvel movies, I think it's not even just those movies that have crowded these small movies out. I think it's critics as well who feel the only means to be relevant is to focus on the superhero movies and on the box office numbers and on the casting news, and are quite hard on, and again, this is not a question, this is a tangential thought, are quite hard on small movies. I've seen a number of small movies this year that I thought were just fine, and critics hammered them and expected them to be Oscar winners and basically killed their chances at the box office. And so therefore, it seems to me that small movies that are personal, that are a directorial vision, have much more to live up to in terms of quality than I think a lot of the superhero movies do.
You're absolutely right. And there is sometimes a cross-purpose in terms of critics and small movies. You know, critics are entertainers. They're and critics now have audiences, and critics have, aggregate power based on their influence and the number of people who read their audience, who read what they write or listen to what they say or watch what they say if they're on television, and that can often be, not always, but it can often be at cross purposes with a small movie trying to break through. I'll leave it at that. I don't envy critics, and it's a complicated business, the relationship between doers and critics.
Yeah, absolutely. Another film that you have coming out relatively soon is The Report, which is the true story of the torture report. Can you talk about the role that you play in that movie? I can't wait to see this film.
It's interesting. That's a wonderful movie made by Scott Z. Burns and produced by Steven Soderbergh.
Have you worked with Steven Soderbergh before?
Well, I've worked with him a little bit in theater, and
in theater. What did you do in theater with Steven Soderbergh?
I did a workshop of The Library, the play that Scott Z. Burns wrote that was done at the Public several years ago about the Columbine shooting.
Oh wow!
And then I was not able to join them to do the play. And then Steven also produced Syriana.
Oh, that's right, yes.
Actually, this is the same producing team. Jennifer Foxx and Steven Soderbergh produced Scott Z. Burns' movie, The Report. And I play, funnily enough, given the news of the day, I play the whistleblower, a whistleblower in the movie, who helps Adam Driver's character, and Adam delivers an incredible performance. I help lead him to discovering the abuses of power and violations of human rights perpetrated by America at black sites with prisoners after 9/11 to try to thwart terrorist attacks. And the movie explores what we did, and it starts with waterboarding, and it goes from there. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful film, gorgeously directed by Scott Z. Burns.
This is maybe your second time probably working with Adam Driver, right? Because he was in Lincoln as well. I don't know if you did any scenes with him.
I didn't have anything with him to do in Lincoln. In Lincoln, I worked with my buddy John Hawkes, wonderful actor, James Spader, and Daniel Day-Lewis, and David Strathairn, and that was the. It was just a nice. We had our own storyline in the movie, and it was great.
That's right. It's pretty incredible camp of people there to be working with.
But Adam is a wonderful, wonderful person, and what a year he's having. He's got Star Wars, The Report, and Marriage Story. And,
yeah, what was it like working with him on set? He's one of those actors that I find, as far as I know, he's putting an incredible amount of effort into the performances and really thinking about them, but he seems on camera effortless in a way, just utterly watchable.
Yeah, there's an honesty to Adam and his work that I think is born of a wildly rich background. You know, he was a Marine. Mm-hmm. And he left that and went to Juilliard and trained there for 4 years. And I also went to Juilliard, and I said, it must seem ridiculous to you when, it must have seemed ridiculous to you when actors in your class would complain about critiques or the workload when you were a Marine. And I was expecting him to say, yeah, tell me about it. And he said, no, in a lot of ways, Juilliard was tougher, which I found ridiculous. I can guarantee you that for me, being a Marine would be a lot tougher than going to Juilliard. Yeah, I think Adam, he's an actor, but he's also so much more, and he's been through so much more. And I think that the experiences that he's had in life have allowed him to cut away a lot of the fat and distraction that can get in our way as performers. And so you just get this real person in front of you. I felt when I was working with Adam like I wasn't acting. I was just in the situation with the real person.
It's exactly what you want.
Yeah.
Yeah. You apparently write while you're shooting movies, right? Is that true? Like in between scenes, do you go write in your trailer?
I do.
How do you do that?
It's like water into cracks and sidewalks. I have to be writing every day.
Yeah.
I just can't not be working on something. And that's in part, I think I'd like to think that's in part because of that I have stuff that I want to say. But if I'm really honest with myself, I think it's just as much to keep depression at bay. I just don't like myself much if I'm not being productive.
Yeah.
And so if I go back to the trailer and turn on a television and just lie there and veg out, I just will feel terrible about myself. Unless it's sports, then I can. If it's the Oklahoma Sooners or the or the NFL or the men's national or women's national soccer team, then I'll watch TV for hours. But
what about reading a book?
And reading a book, yeah. I mean, I always want to be reading, and I always want to be creating. And now I try to write a little less on set because before my James Franco experience that I described earlier, I was doing a bit too much writing on set because I kind of felt I had a character in the bag. And
Like you had when you say a character in the bag,
yeah, I
you
can
had
go
that,
right
like,
now.
that
And
Tim Blake Nelson thing that they
Yeah.
wanted. Yeah.
and I don't take that for granted anymore. And so now I'll only write if I'm on set and I have 4 or 5 hours. But if it's between setups, I will not go and do that because I don't think it serves the project I'm working on as an actor.
Do you put pressure on yourself when you have 4 or 5 hours to produce a certain amount? Do you have a page count or anything? Or is it just like, as long as you're sitting there looking at the material, thinking about the material, that to you could be writing that time?
Page counts are tricky. Word counts are tricky. I'm not a big prose writer, although that is something I'd like to do. So when I'm writing a play or a screenplay, I'm not sure. I have the most fun rewriting, and I certainly never count pages when I'm rewriting. I just rewrite and try to make stuff digestible or readable for others. And my first drafts are rarely that. I'm so insecure initially about page count. I read that, much to my relief, that Woody Allen, when he would write a screenplay, would say, I just want to get to page 90.
Oh, that's nice
And then
to hear.
I know that I have something.
Right.
And until I get to page 90, I'm just desperately anxious.
Yep.
But at page 90, I know that I've got a full-length something. Yeah. And then once you're anchored in that, then rewriting is just bliss. I love rewriting. And that's a bit easier to do on a set.
Yeah, I was gonna say, can you even do a first draft when you're working on anything else? Or is the
No,
first draft
but on
really-
days off, I can
Yeah.
do that. I started writing my play Socrates while I was working on Fantastic Four, because I had days off when the young people were doing their superhero stuff. And so I got a lot done then.
Yeah. I know I have to go to audience questions, but I do want to ask one more. Something else is that simply just because I'm going to go see it at the Museum of the Moving Image in a couple of weeks, and one of my favorite movies, but The Thin Red Line, the Malick movie that you're in, I think it's, for my money, the best war film ever made. I think it's one of the most beautiful films ever made. And I know that the set of that movie was most likely unlike anything else that you've ever worked on. It was every A-list male actor in Hollywood at the time, most of which were not being used.
Right.
And were like hanging out in a bullpen, right?
Yes. Well, there was the A-list actors, and then there was a cadre of which I was a part, and we called ourselves we were the third tier.
Who was a part of that tier?
So you had, I was there, Dash Myhawk, Adrian Brody, Jim Caviezel.
And who became the star of the movie?
Yeah, and wasn't initially. A couple of Australian actors named Dan Wiley and Paul Gleason. A guy named Larry Romano, who was on King of Queens for a while. And Kirk Acevedo, and then another actor named David Herod, and I think that's the group. Oh, and Nick Stahl also. And obviously some of those people have gone,
Yeah.
I've gone on to have something of a career, and Dash Myhawk, Adrian Brody won an Academy Award. So Jim Caviezel was Jesus in the Mel Gibson movie, and then had his own TV show for about 7 or 8 years. But at the time, we were all completely, we couldn't have been more unknown. And then there was this other tier with Jared Leto and John C. Reilly, Woody Harrelson, John Cusack, Nick Nolte, and then there was the top tier, and we were all, it was all very perspicuously clear in terms of our living arrangements. So then you had Sean Penn, and John Travolta and Clooney.
Right.
And they all lived, particularly Sean. Sean had this, and Sean's a great guy. I love that guy. Love Sean. And that's where I met him. And he was incredibly nice, a wonderful human being, an extraordinary human being. But he had the house on the hill.
So he could look down
and then
on
there
all
was
his
this,
peasants.
Then there was this nicer hotel. Oh, Ben Chaplin was another
Right.
in the second tier. Then there was this nicer hotel. And then the third tier, we were at this sort of apartment complex. But it was an amazing process. And yes, you never knew when you'd be called to set. You never knew, even if you had lines in a scene, if they would be thrown to somebody else. It was a quite improvisatory process for a good 5 months. Yeah.
I've been given the rap signal on you.
'Cause I tend to go on.
Yeah, I love talking to you, Tim. Please go on anytime you come on here.
All right.
It's wonderful to talk to you. Just Mercy hits theaters December 25th. The Watchmen is on HBO right now. The True Story of Don Quixote is coming out relatively soon as well, right?
Well, Don Quixote you can screen right now.
Oh, you can screen?
Yeah, the true Don Quixote, and you can screen it on all those various platforms.
Amazing. Tim Blake Nelson, everybody. The great Tim Blake Nelson. Let's hear it.